What is up, and welcome to the Dynasty Refinery, where the goal is to separate misinformation from true information in Dynasty Fantasy Football and get you practical, actionable content. I'm your host, Cal Shoemake, at Calvin and Hobby on Twitter. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today's episode is brought to you by DynastyLeagueFootball.com. If you aren't already, please make sure that you hit the subscribe button to this YouTube channel. Go ahead. You don't want to miss any of the amazing content from the great folks here at DLF, led by Addison Hayes, who also loves it when you hit that like button. So make sure you hit the thumbs up. Really makes him happy every single time that you do. This is session number 2, and today we're going to be diving into the world of scouting and how to use film to make better decisions in our drafts, trades, everything else that we do. It might sound strange, but actually watching football can be good for you in Dynasty Fantasy Football and help give you an edge, but if you do it correctly. So to help us sort that out and figure out what that is, I'm joined by Mr. Matt Waldman. He's the creator of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. He's a football guy, senior staff writer, and author of The Gut Check, great weekly column you need to check out. He is also my birthday twin, which is coming up here very soon. And so, yeah, you may think you know a lot about Matt, but much like a crow, there's a lot more to him than meets the eye. Matt, how are you today?
I'm doing great. It's always nice to be able to get a chance to catch up with you and talk. And this is going to be a fun episode because I think that this is a really important subject for anybody who's just getting into Dynasty.
Absolutely. There can be just so many things out there. It's really good to have a chance to, break some of this stuff down and separate some of that out. And yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and like kind of how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Well, I guess you could say for the past, I'd say 20 years, I've been a writer. For a living, I was a staff writer at the University of Georgia, where I was an associate editor for an alumni magazine, basically at their business school. So I wrote feature-length articles. I also did freelance work for a variety of different outlets, including, the New York Times, Football Outsiders, and as well as other publications outside of football. And before that, I was an operations manager for a corporation with about 10,000 employees. And I had work that dealt with quality processes and analysis of basically monitoring employee performance, where I had learned some certification techniques on what were best practices for creating processes to evaluate that performance. And I'd always been a huge football fan. And, I'd gotten into fantasy football while I was in that career and had started playing it, and then eventually started writing about it back at FF Today with fellow DLFer Mike McGregor, who's a great friend of mine, and really got me started in this industry. And so as I started writing more about it and looking at the draft, and I'd always been interested in the draft and interested in Dynasty as a whole, because my first league with Mike was a Dynasty league, actually. That's how we met. And, I started realizing that that the processes I had learned for monitoring performance could be applied to monitoring really anything. And I thought I'd like to develop this as a way to scout players, because what I had learned in my job was a good process is something that is well defined. It gives a very transparent way of how it scores itself, and it's built in a manner where if you don't have clear definitions of what you're looking for, if you don't have a clear understanding of that the scoring value makes sense, then you change it and you build on it. And that the practice that you have with your evaluation should give you a feedback loop for you to continue to build on that process and develop it. So that's how I created the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. Is I created it back in 2005, basically bought a TiVo, started scouting game, recording every game I could get. And at that time you could put them on discs. So I still actually have, like, in my basement, literally like a chest, like a wooden chest filled with DVD containers from games from about 2005 through maybe 2010, just 5 years worth of stuff, plus, what I've been doing on hard drives since then. But, I started recording games and decided at that point that I wanted to try writing a publication about scouting players.
I love the shout out to TiVo. I haven't thought about TiVo in a long time.
I miss TiVo, man. TiVo was my binky, man, because it was like, you could tape it, and then the NFL was like, or every production company was like, oh, wait a minute, we're giving away content that we can't resell. And it was like, it was fantastic. But yeah,
kids will never understand what a game changer TiVo was.
Yeah,
I love the shout out to Mike McGregor. That's at Draft Buddy. Make sure you guys go follow him. I hope to have him on this for an episode too. There's so much to him too. I'd love to be able to pull out. And like I love that you mentioned your process there and actually having one. I think that's why I've always been drawn to your work, because you do have a process. And actually, we had an interview not that long ago, but before this past season started, where you talked a lot about your process. Today, you're kind of like, we're going to be a little bit more basic, but you're going to help us understand scouting and kind of using film to make better decisions in our dynasty leagues, things like that. But before we do, I just want our audience to get to know you a little bit better with some lightning style about me questions, followed by some word association questions. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
All right. Favorite team?
Cleveland Browns, reluctantly. And reluctantly, they're just slightly above the Baltimore Ravens.
Favorite player, current and all time?
I will probably have to say Nick Chubb. And then all time, Steve McNair.
Oh, I like that. I thought you might say Steve Smith. I've heard you talk about him. But
I love Steve McNair, Steve Smith, Marshawn Lynch are probably all in my top 5. But
what's your favorite movie?
Jaws.
You're going to need a bigger boat.
Without a doubt. Great movie. And if you haven't seen it, even now it holds up today. Even with the phony shark.
Are you a morning person or a night person?
I'm obviously a night person. So yes, I'm very much. Somebody joked with me and said, "I think you're Batman," but but I don't. But I can't tell for sure. But I think the Waldman family fortune is much less than the Wayne family fortune. I'll put it that way.
I've never seen you and Batman in the same room, so yeah.
Okay.
Favorite book?
Gosh, there are so many. I like Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. That's probably up there. That's probably one of my favorites. Yeah. I was a lit major, so.
Favorite quote?
I'll say one that is kind of a thing that I live by, that I think is very true, is that, and it's probably based on a quote. Family isn't necessarily blood, and blood isn't necessarily family.
Love it. Something you used to believe that you now know is wrong.
Let's
say football related on this.
Football related. I used to believe speed was a very important part of quality football play at the skill positions. And now I know that is that can be true based on the player, but there are things that I would call compensatory factors that more than make up for that if you lack that, or that prototypical measurements you see at the combine also can be compensated for by other traits and skill sets if they're in the right kind of balance.
I got a question coming up later that fits right into that. It's so good. Who's the best college football player that busted in the NFL?
I would say there are so many that I could think of that, and I know I'm probably missing a few, but Rashawn Woods was a very good receiver out of Oklahoma State who just never did it. I would say the player who busted in the NFL, and it had probably due to mental health issues more than anything. He had one great year, and that was Brandon Lloyd.
First thing that comes to your mind when you hear the following words or phrases. Analytics.
A layer of information.
Scouting.
A layer of information.
0 RB.
One way to win your league, and something I used to know as upside down drafting.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I've heard you mention that before. NFL Combine.
I think of the underwear Olympics, but that's a pejorative term. It's a layer of information.
Mental toughness.
Essential.
Konami code. Shout out Rich Rebar.
I think I know this is dumb. This is just how my mind works. But I think of Mario Kart, and I think of the Mario Kart lick. And if you don't know what I mean by the Mario Kart lick, then go to YouTube.
Pro days.
Scripted PR.
Draft capital.
Not a predictor of talent.
Football IQ.
In a cross section of conceptual, technical, physical, and intuitive skills.
Very good. Okay, I got some questions for you here. Let's dive into the world of scouting and film a little bit. So let's say somebody says to you, let's just start with this, like, Matt, okay, I watch Red Zone. I have a favorite college team. I kind of watch, for the most part, I might doze off every now and then, but I watch a lot of it. I know who's good. I know who's not. Like, why do I need anything more than that? Or why do I need to listen to somebody who pays attention to more than that?
Okay. Well, the answer is that if you want to understand the context between why you have success at what you're looking at, and obviously you're not perfect because nobody is at guessing players. If they were, they'd be making a ton of money right now doing that. You want to understand the why so that you can have a repeatable process. Otherwise, it's just luck, or it's intuition, and you don't know why you have a good call or why you have a bad call. Or you may not understand that you have good calls based on things that have nothing to do with talent and everything to do with situation. A good example would be, and people may argue with me about this, but a good example would be Elijah Mitchell, who is with the San Francisco 49ers, who is a great fit for what the Shanahan coaching system wanted to do. But if you talk to NFL scouts, if you talk to people who study the game like myself, you'll know that he's not a complete running back. And actually, the guy they drafted ahead of him is a more complete running back in Trey Sermon, but he lacks one characteristic in the same capacity that Elijah Moore has, and that's speed, where that is the one exception that proves the rule about speed, where, if you have all-world Trent Williams, all-world Kyle Juszczyk, and all-world, George Kittle, and all-world Deebo Samuel, and they all block to the edge, you just need speed to get to that edge and hit it hard. Otherwise, when they put you in the middle of the field, which they don't run as much, you average 3.4, 3.8 yards a carry, and you're not that effective of a runner. While the other guy is that effective with the range of things that they do, but he doesn't have that level of speed that Mitchell does, and the coach likes that system. So, understanding these things helps you understand where players fit and move forward. And so, what I would say to that is that when it comes to studying film, you want to understand what techniques are important, what physical skills can be good fits in some places and not others. Why Raheem Mostert got cut by 7 teams and wound up being good in San Francisco. When you may be good on how somebody hit this year. You may be good on how they hit in a year or two. But are you good at picking up players at the end of the year who nobody knows anything about, or wrote off because they didn't hit immediately due to situations that had nothing to do with talent? But if you understood how to evaluate talent, you'd know that these are guys you need to pick up, and then you can use them for your benefit to win leagues, because it's not the guys you draft early that usually make the difference. It's the guys you draft late who way outplay their value, or you can get on the cheap that you didn't have to spend a lot of money for at the end when everyone starts to get hurt, and you need somebody to, who can fill in that running back 2 spot for you, or even that running back 1 spot if you have a bunch of strong wide receivers, or that one wide receiver who Hunter Renfrow that maybe people might go, he's never going to be that good because he's a small slot receiver. Yeah, he can run great routes, but is he ever really going to give you wide receiver 1 numbers? Okay, well, maybe you start leaning on the talent as opposed to, looking at, because the problem is that stats are helpful in helping you identify certain tendencies, but it's the exceptions to the rule, the exceptional players, and the exceptional circumstances rooted in their skills that are the contextual only to that player that can make the difference in you identifying those guys.
When I hear you talk about the Elijah Mitchell and Trey Sermon and some of the things that you just mentioned there, as far as scheme fit and different things like that, and not necessarily looking at great athletes, it reminded me of the time that I interviewed Vincent Smith, wide receiver with the Jets, used to be with the Texans, and he played with DeAndre Hopkins. Of course, I asked him who the best player he'd ever been around was, and it was DeAndre Hopkins. No surprise. But if you look, like, DeAndre Hopkins is not this like jump off the page athlete. If you look at his traditional combine times, things like that, or even his speed score, burst score, agile score, like none of that like is even in like the 70th percentile. And I was like, what makes him, so good? And football IQ was the thing that he kept coming back to. He said he's the toughest player I've ever been around. He's the smartest player I've ever been around, and he's incredibly tough. And I want to circle back to the Trey Sermon and Elijah Mitchell thing. And, we know that Trey Sermon entered the transfer portal when Ramondre Stevenson was coming in. Not that everybody that goes into the portal is necessarily running away from, competition, but is there something in there, like, for a coach like Kyle Shanahan that's just going to play the best player? It's not going to be draft capital necessarily for somebody like him, or like Pete Carroll, when he had Russell Wilson in there like that. Like, is there something about like that mental side or that competitive part that is part of that process in scouting?
It's a great question, and there is a part of that, though I would argue that in this case, it's more about what you brought up with the Shanahan thing is more about the system, and we'll get to that in a minute. But DeAndre Hopkins, let's start with that. DeAndre Hopkins has impeccable technique as a route runner. He also anticipates things really well, and he has great contested catch skill, and he understands how to release from press coverage. If you watch his battles with Jalen Ramsey back in the day with Jacksonville, Houston, they were, and I've profiled those on my site, the techniques involved, his understanding of how to play to the line of the, basically to the border of what's legal and illegal, along with Jalen Ramsey. Both of them know how to test that line and where to step over it and get away with it. And that's a great skill to have as a wide receiver. Also, you understand that, there's a thing called, I call it baseline level athletic ability. If you have the baseline level athletic ability in terms of speed, burst, all those things, if you're in the 70 percentile, that's good enough. That's good enough. If you have great reach, you catch every ball, you can take contact, you run very sharp routes, you understand the techniques to manipulate, you understand how to read zones, and be on the same page with your quarterback. All those things come in play. He's a great man-to-man receiver. And so you have to, if you look at the right things, you understand that he does have the competitive toughness. He has the football IQ, but it's a fusing of all these skills, where there are players who are in the top percentile of a lot of things, like Stephen Hill back in the day with Georgia Tech, who was a very tall, fast wide receiver who, Robert Meacham, and none of them could catch the ball or could run the routes, the diversity of routes that they needed to be able to be in the league and be a primary wide receiver, for their teams. So that's That's an important part. Again, that compensatory factor part. Now, when you ask about Pete Carroll and Kyle Shanahan, I would say there's a difference between the two, though they look alike. Pete Carroll is we like to compete and have guys compete and move in and move up through that. But even with Pete to an extent, but more so with Shanahan. Shanahan is known as a very much a system coach. And this is where fit comes in, and scouting how teams play is as important as scouting the players. And when you scout the coaches, what you learn is that he comes from a system. Outside zone is the big thing, and plays where you run toss or outside, and he likes the perimeter run game and doing a lot of things with that. Same with receivers. He wants receivers who can play multiple spots. Now, what we've seen, and as you've watched, is that he doesn't necessarily use the most talented players. He gets the player at the skill positions. He gets a great line, and then it's all about he wants players who do what he expects the system to do. And this is something that quarterback coaches have talked with me about, that other offensive coaches and scouts talk to me about, is that there are certain system coaches, especially West Coast system guys. They are very strict about this type of position. This wide receivers have to play all three spots. This running back needs to be able to work to the outside. This quarterback must have the footwork to do these types of drops. And if they may have a player that everybody in the locker room goes, this guy is the best overall player in our locker room, but he's not going to play because he doesn't know all three positions. And until he does, we're going to put other players in, Brandon Ayuk, Dante Pettis, we're going to put other players in who can do that one thing that we need them to do right now to maximize that skill set. And they may even undersell players or underestimate players who are good because it's hard to see them in that practice environment. Like you watch, that's part of it too, is that if you don't study film systematically, like stats, you can reverse engineer things, but you wind up not. The danger with certain analytics is that you can reverse engineer things to the point where the causation doesn't equal correlation, and you don't have enough of a sample size, and certain things that you think you're acting are predictive, you're overselling, and you can wind up being right for the wrong reasons, or being wrong for the right reasons. And there can be some complexity with that, where there's a lot of information out there that some of it can wind up being trash, some of it can be gold. Same thing with film. If you don't have a process for how you define what you're looking for, if you don't really understand the techniques involved, the concepts of like how players are supposed to, run behind blocking schemes, how they're supposed to look at zone coverages, how they're, what the communication are supposed to have with the quarterback, what is something that's truly on them, and what's something that's up for debate because it might have to do with how they're coached and the decision they're told to make, then a lot of the things that you're seeing from film can also wind up being trash, where the other things can be gold. And so that's what makes all of this so fascinating and the game fascinating.
I love the self-awareness there. Like I love the, kind of the details, and one of the things about having a process, I mean, there's always going to be things that can fall through the cracks, stuff like that. But having a process is a huge first step. And I think without that, you can get carried away with some narratives. Like I noticed there was a lot of narratives on like, oh, hey, there was nobody else in Detroit, so that's why Amon did great. And then like the narrative was, oh, well, everybody was drawing coverage, that's why Gabriel Davis did great. And one of those two things may even be true, but if you don't have a process, like your narratives can just take you in like contradicting directions. And you actually did a breakdown of Gabe Davis that I want to just use as a springboard for you. But sometimes we look at stats, we look at box scores, and we sort of make our judgments, or like I said, maybe just have those narratives come up and like buy into just whatever we hear. as opposed to going back and looking at like what actually happened. And like, obviously we care about stats because fantasy stats are what matters to us. But once we know the box score, those stats don't matter to us. We need predictive stats. We need to understand what's going to happen in the future to make good decisions. What did you notice with Gabe Davis when you started breaking that down a little bit? And like, obviously he had a big game, for anybody watching this in the future doesn't know, he had a big game against the Chiefs, and you noticed some interesting things, and it helped you to give you some context to the numbers. How can somebody, or why is it important to take that extra step?
Sure, because I mean, two things. Like I study the NFL every week during the season. And I do a column at Football Guys called The Top 10 where I do film breakdowns. And on Twitter, I do dozens of YouTube clips analysis like this every Sunday through Monday afternoon. And then I write this column and take the top 10 of them that have fantasy import from my perspective and write analysis to all of that. So this helps give me a feedback loop because I scout players based on what I think the NFL standard is when I watch college football. You cannot scout college football or study film of college players without applying an NFL standard over the top of it. If you're watching guys and go, he has great boundary awareness, but he only gets 1 foot in bounds all the time. Well, that's not the NFL standard. Or he's wide open, and you're saying the standard for that is he's got 3 steps on a defender. Well, the NFL standard actually depends on the route and whether the shoulder is free, in some instances, as opposed to whether he's got 3 steps. He could, so you have to understand, or like this quarterback processed this fast. Was it fast because he got the ball to the receiver, or was it fast because he anticipated the receiver breaking open based on the read of the leverage of the defender? These are things that you have to apply when you study the film. So when I studied Gabriel Davis at college, my scouting report on him was, listen, he's tall, he has good build-up speed, he's strong. If you get him, allow him to build up speed and break on routes over the middle of the field where he can, catch in situations where he's going to be able to separate, already be accelerating across the field, he's going to catch the ball and do damage because he's hard to catch. And when he's hard to bring down because of that size and build-up speed. He can make good adjustments on the ball. So if you give him some contested catch scenarios, certain fade routes will work fairly well with him. But if you're just going to ask him to run Stephon Diggs style one-on-one routes, he's not going to be that player. Well, they're not asking him to be that player. So when you look at what goes on, it confirms that. You watch the tape and you say, okay, against Kansas City's playing a 2 high safety coverage. And that's, with those 2 safeties, then what happens is that, one of the things they're going to do, there's going to be some routes underneath that are going to be available. There's also going to be routes in the middle of the field that are going to break between the safeties. That's one of the places that you want to attack, is between those 2 safeties, because you're spreading the field in a way where the safeties have to account to give help to the cornerbacks, on each end of each sideline. So Gabriel Davis, when you look at the film over and over again during the playoffs, and actually during any part of the season, he's the second or third option. So when you're the second or third option, it's really about, for the quarterback, that means that he has a longer developing route, and that fits what his skill set is. Dig routes, deep over routes, double moves, deep crossers, things that take time off of play action, where maybe you take a play action and roll out, and maybe that's your first read, but it's all embedded into a fake and misdirection to think that there's something else happening first, when really it's just to buy him time. Or as the second or third read on a route that takes longer than what Stephon Diggs is running. Or for you to identify whether Stephon Diggs is going to break open on a deep route, or whether Dawson Knox is going to break open. And sometimes they put the one or both of those guys in the same side as Dawson Knox to make defenders who are playing over top shade more towards the star players, who are the guys who win one-on-one in every situation, as the ones that the team bets on. They're the scheme play. They're the matchup players. Davis is a scheme player. It doesn't make him a bad player. It just means that you put him within the scheme to do these specific things, and he can do those things well, and he's a complementary player. And so what happened is the Chiefs, with the two high safeties, when you play too high, you're keeping the deep end of the field shut, closed off, hopefully, other than that deep middle, and you're hoping that you can rush the passer and you can get to the passer before he can get to his second or third read. And the Chiefs couldn't get home to Josh Allen because he can escape, and he has got a big arm, and he was able to maneuver the pocket or escape and find his third read. And that third read is breaking wide open in the middle of the field, doing what he does best. And so this is a situation. This is where studying film and understanding scheme, defenses and individual players and how they fit into that scheme all comes together. And you look at it in context and say, oh, that's a good wide receiver number 2 for the Bills. But a good wide receiver number 2, does that make him the second or third option behind Dawson Knox and Stephon Diggs? And in what situations will that be? Is it every week or is it situationally? It's probably situationally, which means, is he necessarily a guy that you would want to be your dead to rights wide receiver 2 and draft him as a wide receiver 2? Probably not. You're probably going to get better value letting other people do that. Doesn't mean he's bad, but if he slips to you and you can make him your wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4, he can give you enough wide receiver 2 weeks that you might get him at the value he deserves to be at, and he's worth being on your team, but he's not worth the hype that people are giving. It's not because he's bad. It's because people are overvaluing his role.
I love that. Great breakdown on every bit of that. So let me ask you 2 more questions before we get out of here. But I know you keep a checklist, like you've got like a, very structured way that you're doing this. Are there any changes that you made to your process for this season? Like any updates on your checklist that?
This year, no, because what I tend to do is I've changed it over the years a lot. And you can go to mountwaldmanrsp.com and you'll find, and I tweet this out a lot, like what goes into the RSP. And I have like an example of a checklist where I just made some major changes to, say, the wide receiver and tight end sections. And this was something that I had been working on for 2-3 years. And then I would kind of test it in the background, but not use it to apply to my analysis to the public. And then I would use that later. So this thing is now, instead of having maybe 60 or 70 points on it of things that I look at, has probably over 100 for wide receiver. And it's those details that matter, because sometimes I would miss certain details with certain aspects of route running that needed to be more granular than what I had, or maybe I overvalued put too much weight on certain areas than I should have, and it led me to situations where there were players that were maybe good technically in certain areas, but not as strong in others, and I didn't have those areas broken down as well. Like I would say Dante Pettis is a good example of a player that I can look at now and say, I still think he could have been a lot better than what he was, and I had rated highly, but his press release skills weren't as good as I thought they were. And I had to learn more about press release skills, to the point that I've consulted some wide receiver coaches to college and NFL players and literally took notes, put them all on my board. This is different from what I had before, but for 2 years, I had a board filled with notes of things that I'd taken and formulated a checklist off of that. And, I would say the results have been pretty good, at least year 1. And part of that is that Jamar Chase got the highest grade I've ever given a wide receiver since I've been doing this. And it's not like the other thing failed. I mean, Cooper Kupp was a player I had rated fairly strong and thought was highly underrated for certain reasons. It's just that you have, again, it's about getting better and continuing to refine what you have. So some things that I am considering are consistency, and I haven't applied it yet, but the good example of one is consistency with or predictability with your press release maneuvers as a receiver. Like you'll see like Treylon Burks of Arkansas is a hot prospect, and he's certainly a fine prospect, but as a press release guy against press coverage, he basically has a two-step move, and he has a wipe, and he may have, and that's basically his go-to. And there are a lot of receivers who have maybe 2 or 3 moves, but they only use one most of the time. And it's so predictable that any good patient cornerback is going to go find something else because I know what you're going to do. And there's times with Burks when you watch him, I was talking about this today on my podcast, that when you watch him, there are situations, as good as he can be, that when teams press him, they go, you know what? We're going to move shade to the inside because you don't have an answer for how to release inside, how to like run an in-breaking route and release inside of a defender who's playing inside shade against you. And he malfunctions. What he ends up doing is he has even a running start, like a 5 or 7 yard head start, and he doesn't have a way to set the guy up. And instead he just tries to run him over. And then the quarterback is like, goes to a second read to Burks and is like, Burks should be wide open in the middle of the field. There's all this room, but he's looking at Burks tied up with a guy that he should have avoided. And now he's taking sacks or having to scramble and come up short. And I've seen it happen repeatedly on his 2020 and 2021 film. And these are examples of, you can have 5 maneuvers, but if you're predictable and you're not unpredictable about how you use them and mix them up, then you really don't have them down. So I want something that talks about, unpredictability, how you disguising that. I'm looking into ways of how do I score that? How do I evaluate that type of thing? Because it's not just whether you have a library of things, it's whether you lean too hard. It's like that guy you play basketball with, and he always makes that one move. And you know it's coming. Now, some guys, they're great enough that it's like, good luck stopping me. And Burks may be that way once in a point. I mean, certainly you could say Des Bryant was that way for a while. You can pretty much say, I'm going to do one of 2 or 3 things and try to stop me.
Right.
Whereas with Stephon Diggs is like, I can kill you with 1,000 paper cuts. Which way do you want to go? You know? And so, there's not a single template, but it's important because, again, with fit, if you put Treylon Burks with San Francisco, he might do great. If you put him with the team that expects him to be Stephon Diggs, well, good luck to Treylon Burks because it ain't going to happen.
Love that. So if somebody was watching this and they, they want to take that next step, watch, do a little bit of scouting on their own from a fantasy perspective, but they're like, okay, I don't have 17 years of experience on this, or more like Matt Waldman. What's some good, just like first couple of steps they could take and first couple things you'd recommend them doing?
Okay, well, first thing I would say is the first article I ever put on my site is called Losing Your Football Innocence. So go look up Losing Your Football Innocence, Matt Waldman RSP. And that will give you basically 10 things that I recommend, that I still put this out and people find it valuable. But some of those things is, watch one player and study that player or that one position. Just start studying one position periodically whenever you have time. Write down what it is that you're going to be looking for and how you define what that is. I would say that's important. Be prepared to have about 8 or 9 hours of time over the course of that, whatever period you give yourself, whether it's a month, whether it's a weekend, whether it's over the course of a quarter, and just take your time. Watch the player and try to answer the questions that you've asked, and answer them in as much detail as you can, and see if some of those things either jive with the questions you're asking or whether they create new questions. I would say before you even do any of that, there are books on positions, on how certain positions work, what they're asked to do, what they're supposed to do. I've read books from guys who coached Marvin Harrison and and Wayne, Reggie Wayne, and a bunch of other guys. And I use that information for what I do. Learn about, scheme that a player fits in, like learn about the decision making that they have to make, learn about the techniques that the players have to have, and then look at the athletic ability within the context of that. So I would say, if you want to know what it feels like to watch film, you can just sit down and start doing it and start asking questions and study. But I'd say if you really want to understand a position, first start reading. Learn from the experts who have coached this game, and it gives you an idea of the context of things. And you might realize that, wow, this guy's a great athlete, but he really screwed all of this up. And that may not work out well for what he's doing here. Or he's doing this well, he's winning because he's athletic here, but will he develop in the league? And that's the other thing is, that's a whole other someday we'll talk about draft capital, and we'll talk about players learning in the league and getting coached up, because neither of those things are, draft capital is good for fantasy as a good fantasy shortcut, but it's not for real as a predictor of talent. It's just playing the percentages predictor of talent, which is different than actually understanding the difference between what's talent and what isn't. But yeah, I would say that's kind of a rambling answer, I know, but I would say the first thing is, losing your football innocence. I have some good things on there. Be prepared to watch things over and over again. Play the game of I Spy. Write down everything that you notice. Write down questions that you have about what you don't understand.
Absolutely. And you have a lot of great resources on your website. I'll give you a chance to promote that here in just a second. But also, you explained some of this in the interview that we did back in, it was April or May, but you can search this YouTube channel for the last interview. And actually, there's a lot of really good information. And just recently listened back to that in preparation for this. A lot of really just great, some in-depth answers and things that we talked about there that we didn't get into here. So, yeah. So if someone wants to look at what you've got, and you do a great job in the rookie scouting portfolio of not just telling people here's what to think about players, but here's my process, and it's a lot of detail. If somebody wants that, where's the best place to find that?
Sure. I mean, because it has a glossary. I mean, if you want to take my process and use it, you could. You could. And my wife always well, someone could steal what you're doing and do it. And I go, yeah, but that would mean that they would have to do the work. And if you do the work, congratulations, because you will probably come up with your own process by the end of that. And you still also have to have an understanding of how to tie things together. So, but at the end of the day, you can find it at mattwaldman.com. You can purchase it directly there, or you can get it at mattwaldmanrsp.com by just looking at my site, and it has all the information about it there. And you can learn more about what people have to say about it, and take a tour and a video tour of the pre-draft and post-draft and all of that.
Absolutely. And also, he's got his Twitter handle right there. You can check him out there at Matt Waldman. Make sure you're following him, of course. Make sure you're following me at Calvin and Hobby. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Dynasty Refinery. Hope you got a little bit smarter about just why scouting, and making sure that you are watching some of that film and going. Everybody is doing what you're doing with watching Red Zone, things like that. Take that extra step. Learn a little bit more about the offenses and about the defenses. Watch a little bit. Just get that edge against your competition in dynasty leagues.